I am Christina Hennessy, so good evening. I am teaching Hispanic Studies and Gender Studies. Maybe you don't know me and I don't know everybody, so I thought I would introduce myself. And I'm one of the faculty who organizes the Thursday Forum. And today we'll have Professor Mary Stenson, who has been teaching in the Exercise Science and Sports Studies Department for 4 years. She teaches courses in health and fitness, sports, nutrition, exercise physiology, and research methods. Prior to coming to CSB she earned her Ph.D. in exercise physiology from Springfield College. And her scholarly interests are in athletic performance and recovery, specifically the use of cold water immersion as a recovery treatment, and health and sedentary physiology. Many of her scholarly interests stem from her own experience as an athlete, and Mary has been running competitively for almost 20 years. So today she's going to present Beyond Basic Exercise Guidelines. Is sitting really the new smoking? So let's welcome her.
Thank you, Christina, and thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see so many faces out there. So the reason really why I wanted to present on this topic is sort of twofold. The first is that I have my own personal experiences with being sedentary as a graduate student, and one of the things I realized when I came here after graduate school was, it doesn't take me long to put on weight. And also, my running started kind of getting funny. I had some hamstring problems and some IT band problems, and I couldn't figure out why. I'm not doing anything different. My exercise is the same. What's different for me? And I finally realized that the different factor was that I wasn't walking between 2 and 3 miles a day, back and forth from my apartment to my lab to the classes I was teaching and various places. So I kind of had my own little struggle with being very sedentary, and now I'm trying to work past that. But the other reason is because this is a really kind of hot topic, and Ergotron, the company that makes a lot of the sit-stand workstations, they've donated their product. You've seen it in the Clemens Computer Lab. There are some in my office, in the classrooms that I teach in. And so it's kind of become more of an issue on campus. A lot of people ask me where I got my standing desk and how they can get one and that sort of thing. So I figured this is a good opportunity to really get more information out there to the rest of you about standing more and sitting less. So one of the things that I really want to put out there is, I'm not here to tell you need to exercise more, although you should. The basic guidelines for Americans for exercise are about 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous activity exercise. So what this means is that you get your heart rate up, you get your breathing elevated, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. So we're not even asking for every day. 5 days a week, 30 minutes, that's all it takes. And it doesn't mean you have to sprint and run marathons and that sort of thing. It means that you walk quickly, or you use an elliptical or treadmill or something along those lines. So not too terribly bad. A lot of individuals find this really difficult to do, with reason. The number one excuse for not getting 150 minutes of exercise a week is that I just don't have time. None of us have time. And it's kind of one of those things that, if you don't have time to do that, let's see what else we can make time for you to do. And that's kind of where the sedentary stuff comes in. So what do those 150 minutes a week equal? We like to, as exercise professionals, we put everything into these nice little frameworks. So we put the exercise guidelines into what we call a FIT framework. The F stands for frequency, so like I said, 5 times a week. Intensity, moderate to vigorous, about 30 minutes a session. And in terms of the type, this is a really wide range. So generally we think of this type of exercise as cardiovascular exercise. Walking, running, elliptical, jogging, that type of thing. But really it should be more than that. It should be resistance training for bone health. It should be flexibility and balance so that you can resist falls, things like that as you're older. It should be more than just cardio. And I should say that the 150 minutes a week is a recipe for decreasing your risk for chronic disease. It's not for your competitive athlete. our marathon runners and triathletes, they've got to do more than 150 minutes. That's not going to quite cut it for them. But for everybody else, 150 minutes, that should do it. That should decrease your risk of heart disease, of getting heart disease. So, like I said, I don't want to go too far into what you do, for your 150 minutes a week. Hopefully you all are doing that. But if not, it's okay. Just got to work towards it. What I want to talk about is what you're doing the rest of the time. So 150 minutes isn't actually that much time during the week. So my question to you is, take a minute, or I guess my challenge to you is take a minute and think about what your normal day is like. And think about what you did today. You got up in the morning, you get ready for the day. Maybe you've got kids, you have to get them ready for the day. You shower, have your coffee, your breakfast. You commute to work. How do you commute to work? Do you walk? Do you ride your bike? Do you take a bus? Do you drive a car? What are you doing when you're commuting? Once you get here, what's your work morning like? For some of us, that means sitting in class for long stretches of time. For some of us, that means standing in class for long stretches of time, which is great. But what is that like for you? Then you have lunch. Then you have work all afternoon, sort of more of the same. You commute home the same way you got here. You eat dinner. Maybe you're getting your kids ready for bed and doing homework and that sort of thing, or catching up on work from the rest of the day. If you're like me in my pre-pregnant state, you like to drink good wine and relax. So think about your day. What does that look like? For some of you that are getting your 150 minutes, maybe you're adding in a run or a walk in the morning. Awesome. Maybe you're adding in exercise during your lunch hour. My office is right next to the fitness center, so I see you, and that's great. It's so busy there at noon. I love it. I love to see that. Maybe you're walking the dog in the evening before after you have dinner. There are actually some neat studies that show that people that have dogs and walk them regularly have no problem getting their 150 minutes a week. They almost always meet that and exceed it. So that's great. So you're getting your 150 minutes a week. Good for you. Kudos. I commend you for that. Excellent. But what are you doing with the other 6,570 minutes that you're not exercising or sleeping? That's a lot of minutes compared to your 150 minutes. What are you doing with this time? So maybe you're preparing food, you're eating food. That takes a lot of time. You maybe are reading, you're watching TV, you're working on a screen. These are sort of your after dinner or morning type things, catching up on the news. You're commuting, right? You're catching up on work. You're catching up with family and friends. Maybe you are watching your kids play sports. That takes a lot of time. Watching practice, that sort of thing. But once you add all these other activities in and whatever else it is that you're doing during the day, those 150 minutes don't really seem like a whole lot at this point. 6,000 minutes? That's a lot of minutes. So the 150 minutes sort of seems inconsequential compared to the other 6,000 minutes. So what are you doing during this time? You're sitting. When you do all those activities, you're sitting, watching, doing something else. So lots and lots of sitting. On average, American children and adults spend about 55% of their waking hours sedentary. That's a lot of time. This is on average. This isn't everybody. So I'm not really here to talk about how much exercise you're getting. Too much sitting is not the same as not getting enough exercise. They're sort of different entities. So really what I want to talk about is the sitting piece. That being said, make sure you're getting your 150 minutes. So where does this all come in? One of the questions that Christina asked me before we started was, this is kind of new. We haven't heard much about this, maybe in the past few years, but that's about it. This field of sedentary physiology has really stemmed from exercise physiology. And exercise physiology is not a very new field either. It is a very new field. It's not a very old field. But generally, exercise physiology encompasses that end of the spectrum that's higher intensity exercise. We think of that as being our athletes, our more competitive type exercise beyond just what's required for health. The opposite end of the spectrum then is all the other things, the light intensity exercise, the stuff that we do with our other 6,000 minutes a day. Generally, we refer to this continuum of intensity by METs, A MET is also a metabolic equivalent. So for those of you who are sitting right now, you're working at about 1 MET. So it's the energy that your body needs to just do its normal processes at rest. So everything above 1 MET or above 1.5 METs is technically not sedentary. So a group of researchers have gotten together and they've said, we need to define this because in all the literature there's not a very good definition of what is sedentary. Everybody sort of defines it a little bit differently. And as a result, we don't have very good research up to this point in terms of what does sedentary mean. So they've defined sedentary as any waking behavior, so you have to be awake. Sleeping doesn't count, which is good for us that are very sedentary. That has greater than 1.5 METs of energy expenditure. So standing, that counts. Walking, that counts. So light intensity activity, that all counts as not being sedentary. You have to be in a sitting posture, and or a reclining posture. So even if you're sitting, you kind of lean back just a little bit. It's so much easier that way. Yes, that's still easy. So this is kind of the idea of sedentary physiology and where it came from. So the next question is, how do we measure this? And we measure a bunch of different ways. The first is by daily recall, and this is seemingly the easiest. This is basically what I just asked you to do. Think about your day. What did you do today? How long does it take you to do those things? Were you sitting? Were you standing? What were you doing? The problem with daily recall is we're not very good at it. We tend to misrepresent our sedentary time when it's just be a recall. So if I just asked you, how many hours did you sit today? I don't know, 6, maybe 7, I'm not really sure. It takes a long time to think about that. So it's not entirely accurate. The other way that seems to be a little bit better is measuring sedentary time via TV viewing time. And if you think about how you watch TV, that kind of makes sense. We watch TV in half-hour and hour blocks. So I can say, oh yeah, I watched 2 shows tonight, so that was 2 hours of TV. That was 2 hours of sedentary time. And so that's a little bit better, stronger associations with cardiometabolic risk. We look at TV time as opposed to daily recall or total sedentary time. We can also measure with TV time and other screen time, so your computer time, your iPad time, that sort of stuff, if you can measure that. The fourth way is via questionnaire. And these actually tend to be valid and reliable for most individuals. The most famous one that we see, or the one that's used the most often, is called the IPAC, the International Physical Activity Questionnaire. The IPAC originally was used to gauge physical activity in individuals, so how much are you doing, getting your 150 minutes a week. But it asks a lot about the rest of your day. It asks about commute, it asks about your job, it asks about your leisure time activities. So getting all of that extra information is really useful for, we can measure your sedentary time along with your exercise time. So the IPAC seems to be a good questionnaire. And there are several others, valid and reliable measures for measuring sedentary time. The most accurate and the most expensive, of course, are the use of accelerometers. Accelerometers give us an idea of how much you're moving and at what intensity you're moving. They can be worn on the wrist, like this picture here. You can wear them on your arm, you can wear them on your thigh, kind of like a pedometer around your waist. And they give us a pretty good idea of what is your light intensity activity like, or your moderate to vigorous intensity activity too, if you want that. But one of the issues that we have with accelerometers is if I'm standing still, I'm not moving anywhere. So it's not really picking up that I'm going someplace. And so it's measuring my standing still time as sedentary time. There have been advances in these, so we actually can use inclinometers now that measure if you're sitting or you're standing in your transition from sit to stand. But for the most part, those tend to be the best measured. Like I said, they're also the most expensive measured, which is kind of unfortunate. So what you're really here to hear is what really happens. So we're sitting a lot, that's great, we know we sit a lot. What happens in our bodies when we do sit a lot? And I've kind of broken it down into 5 categories. The first is mortality. How the long and short of that is, how soon are you likely to die if you sit a lot from cardiovascular disease or other health-related diseases? What's your risk for cardiovascular disease? Problems with weight gain, diabetes, and then there are a bunch of other factors I've kind of just put into other consequences. So I'm going to kind of take you through each one of these. Feel free, by the way, if you want to sit, stand, transition, do whatever you want. You want to take breaks, that's fine. No one's judging you if you are standing and you sit. So don't feel bad about that. I understand. Or if you're leaning, that's fine. So in terms of mortality, like I said, the long and short is the more we sit, the sooner we're likely to die of health problems. It really is kind of that simple. This is not new news, unfortunately. We've known about this for quite a long time. The sort of premier research in this area was done back in the 1950s by a guy named Jeremy Morris, and he studied the conductors and the bus drivers on double-decker buses in London. And what he found was that the conductors who walked up and down the stairs all day, taking tickets, doing whatever they're doing, they managed to get in about 600 stairs a day during their shift on the bus, where the drivers were about 90% of their shift sedentary. And they just sat and drove the bus, that was their job. The other thing he found was that the conductors had about half of the incidences of heart attacks than the bus drivers did. So huge differences in risk between being a bus driver and being a conductor in this population. So like I said, this was back in the 1950s. This isn't new news. We're just now kind of taking it into our own perspective and into our own lives. We know about this. Originally we thought though that the conductors were so much better in terms of their health because, well, they were doing so much more activity, right? So we were looking at it from the sense of more physical activity equals you're doing something better. We weren't looking at it from the opposite side of sitting is a bad thing. So we were kind of just taking this physical activity approach. And again, like I said, that's kind of how the study of sedentary behavior stemmed from exercise physiology. So this was in the 1950s. In probably the early 2000s, there started to be more and more interest in this area. So just to kind of give you an idea of what kind of risk we're talking about here. In the graph, you can kind of see on the y-axis there's an increased risk of mortality. I have two studies that are listed here. The first is Patel and colleagues. They studied US adults, so Americans, just like most of you, ages 50 to 74, so middle-aged adults. And they did a 14-year follow-up study, so they started off 14 years later, they took all these measurements, and what they found was that the individuals that sat more than 6 hours a day, so this is just sitting, not TV, nothing else, just sitting, they sat more than 6 hours a day, they increased their risk of mortality by all causes, which is in the blue there, by about 34%. Okay, for cardiovascular disease, they increased their risk by about 33%. So pretty substantial risk over 14 years. In a group of Canadian adults, similar age, I think they were actually a little bit younger, they maybe started at 30. Again, a follow-up of 13 years. When the adults were asked about how long do you sit during the day, if they answered that they sat about 3/4 of the time, their risk for all-cause mortality was about 36%. For cardiovascular disease, it was about 47%. So kind of getting up there. And this is only 3/4 of the time. When they responded that they sat all of the time, their risk was about 54%. So again, increasing. What I should tell you though too, is that these numbers are for females only. The females' percentage of increase for risk over this time period was actually higher than the males. They're not too different, but the females was a little bit higher. In terms of why, still working on that one. Not quite sure what the gender difference is there, or what the sex difference is that's causing a difference, but there is one. So I wanted to kind of show you the higher numbers. What's even more shocking is a study of 4,500 Scottish men that were over 35 years old. Their risk of all-cause mortality was about 48%, was up about 48%, with 4+ hours of TV a day. So we're not just talking about sitting, we're talking about TV time. 4 hours of TV is quite a bit of TV during the day. And if you work 8 hours a day, to watch 4 hours, that's a lot of TV on top of that. But it's totally possible. Switch out your TV for your computer screen when you go home. Same thing, right? It's no different. So 48% increase. But here's the one that really gets me. Their risk for cardiovascular disease mortality in this time period, 125% increase. That's huge. That's a massive increase for 4 hours of TV a day. Similar results in, these were in a sample from the UK, so much bigger sample, about 13,000 men and women, again, a little bit older population, 45 to 79. Their all-cause mortality increased 5% for every hour of TV they watched, 8% for cardiovascular disease for every hour of TV they watched per day. Australians, same thing. So we've done the Americans, the Canadians, the Brits, the Australians, the Scots, right? They're all pretty much the same. We're getting high levels. I could go on and on. I could tell you about 10 more studies that show almost the exact same results. So really staggering. When I talk about cardiovascular disease mortality, mainly I'm talking about heart attacks, stroke, other heart-related illnesses. So deal with atherosclerosis, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, all those types of things. The one mortality rate that really has no association with sedentary time is cancer. So everybody's been kind of looking at this relationship, and there doesn't seem to be a significant relationship between sitting and cancer.
I just have a quick question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
How does exercise get looped into these numbers when you're looking at, just trying to figure out, is the assumption that there's absolutely no exercise taking place in these people's lives? I'm just trying to figure out how that weighs in.
That's a great question, and you're just working ahead of me. But
Okay,
that's a really good
okay.
question. So the key is here that all of these studies, and all the ones I'm going to continue to talk about, this is supposed to be the big kicker at the end, but that's okay. All of these studies, I'm kidding. All of these studies and everything I'm going to talk about from here on out, the researchers have controlled for moderate to vigorous physical activity, so it doesn't matter how much you exercise. They've controlled for age, they've controlled for sex, they've controlled for smoking, they've controlled for BMI. A lot of times they've controlled for sedentary time, so when we're talking about breaks, they've controlled for that too. I mean, the list of factors, covariates, that the researchers have controlled for is so long, you almost think, well, how is it possible you're even getting this? How are you getting anything that's even close to significant with that many covariates? But yeah, that's a great question, and it's all controlled for. So this type of risk, it doesn't even matter at this point what your activity level is like. So they're controlling for exercise. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to what the cardiovascular disease risk looks like. What's happening in your body when you're sitting? And basically we can run right through every single risk factor for cardiovascular disease, literally, right down the list. The only things that we can't control for are age and sex, and that's about it. Family history. Those are the only risk factors that we're not talking about here. All the other ones are impacted by your sitting time. So, in terms of blood lipid levels, the ones that we don't want to be high, your total cholesterol, your triglycerides, increase when you sit. The ones that we do want to be high, the good cholesterol, the HDL, goes down when you sit. There's impaired lipid metabolism, so the enzymes that help you break down the fats in your blood to get to those more optimal blood lipid levels stop working as efficiently. And it actually doesn't take a whole lot of exercise or a whole lot of sitting for those enzymes to kind of shut down or to decrease their activity. Endothelial dysfunction, so the endothelium is the inside of your blood vessels. Some researchers have shown that with sedentary time, there's a decrease in blood flow to muscles, especially calf muscles, and a decrease in the vessel diameter. So when you take things like all of the cholesterol changes, basically you end up with high cholesterol. That's your risk factor for heart disease. When you're talking about an increase in blood pressure and a decrease in blood flow, maybe add on some atherosclerosis from your increased blood lipid levels, you're talking about a heart attack. So really, we're going right down the list for risk factors for heart disease. There's also been a lot of very new research, like within the past year, about the risk for blood clots in sitting. This also kind of doesn't seem totally new. We've heard lots of information probably in the past 15 years about truck drivers and their risk for blood clots in their legs and their lungs. People who are very sedentary, same thing. You're sitting all the time, just like the truck drivers are. Part of this is due to an increase in fibrinogen. which is a molecule that turns into fibrin. Fibrin makes blood clots. And so it's kind of an easy pathway for us to follow, for researchers to follow. And the last one here is an increase in inflammation. This is sort of a new area of viewing the risk of heart disease. A small protein that we find in the body called C-reactive protein, or CRP, is really strongly associated with risk for heart disease. So we find that in people with heart disease, their risk or their levels of CRP are quite high. With sitting, we find more CRP in the blood. It's a pretty easy one to measure, and it's a marker of inflammation. So again, increasing our risk for cardiovascular disease. So we've basically hit all of the major risk factors: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, poor blood flow, inflammation, blood clots, you name it, one right after another, all happening with sitting. And a lot of these, for a lot of these studies, it hasn't taken a whole lot of sedentary time to produce these changes. The blood clots, the fibrinogen study, I think those researchers had their subjects sit uninterrupted for about 5 hours. That's a work day. That's not terrible. You eat your lunch at your desk, you can get 5 hours, no problem. Some of the other researchers have had individuals on bed rest, so they look at people as they come into the hospital, whether they're sick or healthy, and they bring them in. They have them sit for bed rest for as little as 4 days. So imagine being knocked out with the flu. You're in bed for 4 days. It doesn't take a whole lot of time for these things to start building up. So there's your cardiovascular disease risk. The other one that people are pretty concerned with is weight gain. There's a pretty simple kind of way to look at this, and one of the way to do that is to think about what you're expending and what you're taking in. The more we sit, the fewer calories we tend to expend. We're using as much energy to sit as we are to stand. There's also some evidence that I'm going to talk about in a second here that we tend to eat more when we sit. So if we're expending less and eating more, that's a recipe for weight gain. Right? And it doesn't happen overnight. You don't gain 10 pounds when you sit for one day. It's a buildup. It's a slow increase over time, over 10 years. Suddenly you put on 20 pounds. You're like, how'd that happen? So it doesn't take a lot of time. And this is a really simplified model of how weight gain happens. It's a lot more complicated than that. There are a lot of factors that go into weight gain. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as eating and exercising, but this is kind of we're going to take the simple route. We don't need to get into the complicated route. So, just to kind of give you an idea of what those numbers look like. In Canadian adults, over a span of 6 years, their waist circumference increased by about 0.13 centimeters for every 15-minute increase that they had in sedentary time. One of the ways that we measure weight gain, and it's not really necessarily weight gain, but risk for cardiovascular disease and other chronic diseases, is waist circumference. So you can put on weight or put on fat, adipose tissue in various places in your body. We found that the most troublesome area is right around your midsection. And this tends to be the area that's the worst in terms of cardiovascular risk factors and risk factors for diabetes. All of your metabolic organs, your liver, your pancreas, they're all right there. And so to have all the extra fat around there really increases your risk. So we tend to look at weight circumference as a measure of risk. To give you kind of another perspective, Australian workers that sat more than about 5.8 hours in their working day, their waist circumference was about 6 centimeters greater than people who sat less than that amount of time. They also had a BMI that was slightly higher. So BMI is kind of a measure of a ratio of your weight to your height. Again, another risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And another one, over 5 years, and an increase in TV viewing time was associated with about a 0.5 centimeter increase in waist circumference for men, and a little bit more than that for women. Again, I could go on and on. I could show you 10 more studies of increases in waist circumference with sitting time. You can go all day on this. But the real question is, how the heck is this happening? Why are we expending less energy? What's going on here that's causing this change? And really what it comes down to is we engage a lot less muscle mass when we're sitting than when we're standing. You think about when you're sitting, especially if you're kind of leaned back just a little bit, you're not turning on any muscles in your body, especially not the really big ones. And your muscles consume a lot of energy. It doesn't take much to turn them off. So you're sitting back a little bit, you've turned off your your back muscles, your core muscles, your leg muscles, your biggest muscle in your body, which is your gluteus maximus muscle, that's not on. This doesn't need to work. You're sitting. You don't have to turn anything on. That's why it feels so good to sit, right? You don't have to expend any energy. When you stand up, you turn those muscles on, right? You're using your back muscles and your core muscles to keep you straight. You're turning on your gluteus to keep you up. Your calf muscles are activated. So a lot more energy expenditure happening in this position than that kind of sitting slouch position. So in terms of how much energy, I can tell you that too. This group of researchers, Levine and colleagues, they wanted to see, okay, exactly how much energy are we talking about here? How many calories are we expending in these different positions? So they brought a bunch of people into the lab. They measured them in several conditions. I've listed here 6 of them. Actually, I did, I think, 8. They had a resting condition, people were just sitting. They had a sitting and fidgeting condition. And they didn't tell people how to fidget. They just said, sit and kind of fidget a little bit, move around, versus just sit and don't move. It's like being in church. So sitting and fidgeting. They did standing and not moving condition. They did standing and fidgeting condition. So exactly what I look like up here, this kind of moving around a little bit, fidgeting. Then they had them walk on a treadmill, 1, 2, and 3 miles an hour. And they measured their energy expenditure across all of the conditions. The standing and the fidgeting had an energy expenditure that was about 94% greater than just plain resting. I challenge all of you to stand and not fidget. It's impossible, you can't do it. I see you're in the back, you're kind of swaying, you're moving. You can't stand and not fidget. So I figure the standing motionless, that's not really worth it. To put up here. But 94% increase, that's pretty good, right? 54% if you're just fidgeting. So I'll take the standing and fidgeting. That's extra calories. So in terms of calories, what we're talking about is from resting a little over 1 to a little over 2 calories per minute. Okay, add that up over the course of your day. Add that up over the course of your week, over the course of your semester, 2 semesters, and then 10 years from now, that's not looking so bad, right? And that extra 20 pounds might start to be attenuated a little bit. I include the treadmill data because these are the speeds at which you may walk, or people find it the most comfortable to walk if they're using a treadmill desk. So if you've got your desk hooked up and you're kind of walking slowly, these are the speeds people tend to walk at. Very slow, so you can still do your work, but enough that still, you're expending a lot extra energy just walking at that slow pace. That's great. So we're expending less energy. We're also eating a little bit more. And I kind of have 2 theories for this. One of them is supported by research. The other one is supported by my own experiences. The one that's supported by my own experience is when you sit down to do some work, doesn't matter if you're sitting down for TV, sitting down to get your work done in the evening, and you take a snack with you, and then 20 minutes goes by and you look down and say, who ate that whole bag of chips? You realize you're the only person in the room. So we call that mindless eating. It happens a lot when we're sitting. It could happen when you're standing. I tend to do it in my office sometimes when I'm standing. But that's one theory that I have. You get involved in something and then all of a sudden you're eating, you don't realize it. But the theory that actually is backed up by research is this idea that there may be an increase in energy intake for people who work in knowledge-based jobs. So, So in the span of about 60 years, or maybe even more than that, 100 years, we've seen a huge shift in the American work environment. Right? We went from working in farms and agriculture to working behind a desk at a computer. The great majority of people. So what we've shifted from is this physical labor, which is very energy intensive, to knowledge-based labor, which is not very energy intensive because we're sitting, we're not standing, we're not moving, we're not doing anything. So kind of a huge difference. So this group of researchers, and they have a really kind of neat study, and I think it applies to most of us, or all of us. They looked at how much energy do you really spend when you're doing what they called knowledge-based work. So all of their conditions were sitting. They basically brought in 20 to 30-year-old women. They had them do 3 conditions in the lab. The first was a control, so they just sat quietly for 45 minutes. That was all they did. The second was a reading and writing task. So they had them read a bunch of passages, write a summary about it. Took them 45 minutes. The third was a test battery condition. They had them do a whole bunch of cognitive tests on a computer. Took them, again, 45 minutes. After the tests, they invited their participants for a free lunch buffet. Go ahead and eat whatever you want. They measured everything that the participants ate. Everything they ate, everything they didn't eat. What they found was that in the 2 knowledge-based conditions, they actually ended up eating more calories than they did in the control condition. So not totally surprising. You're working hard, right? 45 minutes of intense mental work, that will make you hungry. The thing was, is the subjects weren't hungry. They reported feelings of hunger that were the same as the control condition. There were no differences. So how does that reconcile itself? You're not hungry, but you're eating more. One of the other things that the researchers measured was glucose and insulin flux during their mental tasks or during their knowledge-based tasks. And what they found was that during those 2 knowledge-based conditions, their glucose and insulin levels in their body fluctuated a lot, versus the control condition where they had blood glucose that just sort of did this nice little steady decline until they got hungry for lunch. So the hypothesis, or the conclusion, I guess, was that knowledge-based work takes more energy than we think, first of all. Our brains require a lot of glucose, just like our muscles do. Our brains require that. So how do we kind of make up for that? And we make up for it by eating more. So in sort of my wrap-up of weight gain, I guess what I can say is, yes, you're expending fewer calories, and if you're doing knowledge-based work, you could also be eating more and not even realizing it. You don't realize that you're hungry, your brains are working hard, so you end up eating a little bit more. All right, so let's move on to risk for diabetes. This is the other major chronic disease that we're talking about in terms of what's happening when we sit and how does sitting affect us. Just to give you a really brief physiology background, for those of you that are not familiar with it, when we have a change in our blood glucose, for example, our blood glucose goes up, insulin is secreted by the pancreas to bring blood glucose back down to normal. That's kind of what's happening here. If we don't, insulin does that, muscle action does the same thing. So if I eat and then I go exercise, the muscle action, the contractions that I'm doing while I'm exercising will also help me reduce the glucose that's in my blood. And not to dangerous levels, it reduces it back down to normal, but it brings it back down to normal nonetheless, and very quickly. So just to kind of give you an overview of how that works. So the more sitting we do, the higher risk we are for developing diabetes. And really this comes from all of the same risk factors that we talked about with cardiovascular disease. Weight gain, cholesterol, blood pressure. All of those things feed into diabetes as well. But there are kind of 2 things that happen when we sit. The first is that because we have limited muscle actions, we limit the amount of glucose our muscles are going to take in. Right? There's still insulin, so if I'm eating while I'm sitting, insulin will help bring my blood glucose back down to normal, but it'll also help me store some of that glucose. We generally store it as fat, so anything extra we'll store as fat, which is great. I'd rather store that glucose in my muscle, and by store it, I mean use it to make energy. So when we have postprandial blood glucose, which means after we eat, that remains elevated for quite some time until all of the blood glucose can be taken care of, either stored or used. When we even do light intensity activity, and by light intensity I mean standing instead of sitting, that blood glucose drops even faster. Right? So it's not staying as high for as long, again, which decreases the amount that we'll store. So this has pretty important implications for managing diabetes and for your risk of heart disease in terms of bringing that glucose down. There's also some great evidence that their insulin sensitivity decreases. So eventually if we have these really high levels of glucose in our blood and really high levels of insulin all the time because we're trying to bring it all back down to normal, the cells sort of stop responding to that, and they stop, they stop really responding to the insulin, so they're not really paying attention, and they're saying, we're not going to take in any more glucose. So all it takes is about 5 days for your insulin sensitivity to decrease. Again, imagine yourself put up with the flu, 5 days of bed rest, and this really is going to go down, which puts you at risk for diabetes. A couple of other things that happen when we sit. One, our bone mineral density tends to decrease. We need some force on our bones in order to keep them strong, so standing and moving helps us do that. There are some interesting studies that have examined depression and anxiety with more sitting time. And what the researchers have found that if you're sitting for more than 42 hours a week, your risk for depression and anxiety increases by about 35%. Right? That's pretty high. Productivity, in terms of how that changes with sitting and standing, we're not entirely sure, but people tend to perceive that they're more productive when they stand versus when they sit. This one's still being researched, and I'll kind of talk about this in a little bit, but there doesn't really seem to be any difference in the research that does exist, so that's at least positive. Okay, so you're sitting a lot, all these bad things are happening, and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but I exercise, right? And you said that was good, and you said that was good for cardiovascular disease. So here's my big conclusion, was that, yeah, even if you get your 150 minutes a week, yes, all of this still happens, because all of those studies, they controlled for activity, moderate to vigorous activity. So yes, all of this is still happening. And you basically have what we call the active couch potato. You get your 30 minutes a day, that's great, good for you. Too bad you're sitting the rest of the time, and the 30 minutes a day isn't going to do much for you. Right? So we have what you see in kind of the open circles there, where the individual's below their 1.5 minutes for most of the day. And this actually tends to happen a lot with athletes because they work hard. Right? Exercise is not easy. It's taxing. So you come home and you're like, I earned it. I'm going to sit for the rest of the day. I do that too. It's, we're not judging anybody here. But what we want to do is try to get you to what looks like in those closed circles, where you're a little bit more active. And that's our active non-couch potato. So how do you go about all of this? What's the most important thing? The most important thing are breaks. And I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly here because we've already talked about all the things that sitting can do for you that are not good for your health. Taking breaks from your sitting literally reduces every single one of those things. Every single one. So the more breaks you take, the better. And we can literally go through every single one of those. Before, when I talked about the FIT principle with exercise, for sedentary behavior, we have what we call the SIT principle. I love those. Your frequency, your interruptions in your sitting time, again, the most important thing, the duration of your sitting and the type of your sitting. So kind of think of those, what are those things and how do they impact your life? So here's an example of our breaker versus our prolonger. This is a sample from an accelerometer. So what does the day look like? And you'll see on the far side there, all of the big dark blocks are the times when that individual was sitting. So huge prolonged chunks of time. Versus the person that's on your right, which has a lot of the little white interruptions in there. So what is a break? A break is 2 minutes every half hour. And some breaks don't even have to be that long. Some researchers are saying 1 minute every half hour. Just getting up and literally standing. It doesn't have to be intense. You don't have to sprint on your 2 minute break. You just have to get up and walk to the restroom. You have to get up and walk to the water cooler to fill up your glass. That's your 2 minute break. That's all you need. Right? The breaks are important. The intensity does not matter. Again, I'm going to kind of flip through these pretty quickly. Your cardiovascular risk goes down because you're decreasing the bad cholesterol and increasing the good cholesterol. Your weight gain, a couple of researchers have shown that standing and walking for, again, 2 minutes, an hour, resulted in an extra 300 to 650 calories a week. It doesn't seem like a lot, but again, add that up over all the weeks you work. I don't know about you, but I'll take 650 calories a week. That feeds my happy hour on Friday, so I'll take it. That means I have to walk 2 minutes every hour? All right. Not so bad. More success with weight maintenance. Again, lower circumference, waist circumference with interruptions. In terms of diabetes, breaks, better insulin function, better glucose better glucose regulation in the body. In terms of your other consequences, you're just generally likely to be happier. If you're healthier, you're likely to be happier. And there's a lot of good health psychology research that says if you do one healthy behavior, you're more likely to do more than one. Right? So standing and taking breaks might lead to parking your car further away. It might lead to choosing a better meal or a better snack. So one healthy behavior tends to lead to more. So one of the things I guess I wanted to bring up here that I kind of forgot about was I talked a little bit with some folks before the presentation about how do we get standing workstations at CSB, and unfortunately I don't have a good answer for you. A lot of people have asked me about this. How can I get one of those workstations? Who can I request them through? Unfortunately, there's no central channel, and departments have been saddled with that cost. So if you want one, talk to your department head. Unfortunately, departments don't have money for that.
I'm gonna call Beth Pettit out, have her tell you how cheap hers was.
So there's an IKEA hack you can do for $22.
Yeah, there are great hacks. Jana got a great little thing from IKEA that's mounted on her wall and uses that. I used an AV cart for a little while. Like there are tons of things you can do, and I'll kind of talk about a little bit about that in a minute. But say you can't get a desk, you're not going to spend a couple $1,000s on a desk. Take breaks. That's all I'm telling you. Just take the breaks. Doesn't matter how much sitting time you're getting, as long as you're taking the breaks, that's what we want you to do. So, your employer says, that's an eyesore, or we don't want those standing desks. Just take your breaks, and you'll be okay. Hopefully they don't say that. Other alternatives, the treadmill desk is an alternative. Again, great energy expenditure here. The problem is, if you can't front the couple $100s for the standing desk, you're probably not going to be able to front the couple $1,000s for the treadmill desk. So, yeah, not great. The exercise balls, sitting on exercise balls, that's fine too. And the energy expenditure tends to be the same with the exercise balls and sitting. With standing, I'm sorry. People tend to find standing to be a little bit more comfortable. Again, it's just personal preference. But let me tell you about how this kind of plays out at CSB and SJU in terms of sedentary time. So I surveyed about 513 students, faculty, and staff about their sedentary time. And this was last spring. In terms of just asking them how much do you sit during the day, remember, not a super reliable measure. The average was about 7.5 hours a day. If you think about your total day and the amount of time that you sit, I'm willing to bet that this is a little low. I mean to call you all out. What I'm saying is, I think that you probably sit more than this. In terms of their TV time, they said a little over an hour. In terms of their computer time, they said 4 hours on average. Again, 4 hours of computer time? I don't know. I'm not buying it, but maybe. So then I thought, well, maybe if I break it up between students and faculty and staff, it will be a little bit different. And actually, it wasn't so different. The computer time was better with faculty and staff, but with students, again, the reported seated time, a little over 7 hours. Same thing with faculty and staff. I have a bunch of students in my health and fitness class every year, and I make them do an assignment where they go through and they write up their time that they spent sitting throughout the day. And they're very good at it, I have to say. They do a great job of being very precise, like down to 5-minute increments, which is great. And I've had students report that they sit anywhere between 4 and 14 hours a day. The 4 was a total outlier, but I feel like I have to mention her because I commend her for her effort. She converted her shelves in her dorm room to a standing desk. So she puts her computer on her shelf, and that's how she stands during the day. And she's also very fit, and so she kind of is on one end of the spectrum, but most of them fall between 8 and 14 hours. This semester I hope to do a little bit more research on this. I've taken one of my classrooms, this is in Murray 1, and I've converted the tables, the ESS department has converted the tables to standing tables. So half the class can stand and half the class can sit. I do get quite a few sitters, unfortunately. But at the advice of one of my students, she said, well, why don't you move it so that the standing tables are by the door? A, you can see better in those long classrooms, and B, then students have to walk past all of the standing tables to get to the sitting tables. And it's actually worked really well this semester. So
Make
that
the
was
second
great.
and third rows the standing ones.
And
And all the ones that are scared, they're always scared to sit in the front.
Yeah, they're scared to sit in the front row, so yeah, that would be great. And then you can't see in the back, so you've got to stand in the front. In terms of long-term plans, I'd like to do, and this is maybe 2 or 3 years out, do more of a long-term study with staff on campus that tend to sit a little bit more, and do an intervention where we can add in sit-stand workstations and see what kind of physiological changes we have. So, you don't think you do a lot of sitting? I challenge you, calculate your sitting time and see what happens there. What do you do about it? just kind of some tips. What can you do? So when you're standing at work, or if you can't stand at work, what are the best ways to go about this? Like I said, take breaks every 20 to 30 minutes. If you need to, set a timer. A lot of people say I have a hard time focusing when I stand. I'm not used to it, so I can't concentrate. If you set a timer for 20 minutes, in my experience, I tend to be a little bit better and say, okay, I've only got 20 minutes. I'm going to have to work a little bit harder here for 20 minutes, and then I can take my break. I look forward to it. It's like, I'm going to take my break, then I'm going to go and chat with the people in the other office, and so it gives you a little bit smaller chunks of time. And there are great timers out there for this, focus booster, tomato timers, Pomodoro style timers that work well for this. Encourage your colleagues to take breaks. One of the sort of premier researchers in this field, they've been doing some studies in Australia with encouraging workplace sedentary time to decrease, and one of the things that they find is that the more encouragement you have and the more kind of social support there is for standing and taking breaks and being active, the better people tend to do. So, commend your colleagues for doing a good job and taking breaks, for exercising. Say it out loud to them. They like that kind of thing. Brainstorm while you're walking. Take your meetings to the field house in the HCC and walk around at lunchtime. That's a great way to do a meeting. Get your exercise in. You don't have to sit at your desk. Get a small water bottle. That way you have to get up and fill it more often. It means you're also going to the bathroom more often. You're getting up and taking breaks. If you tend to use your stapler a lot, put it at the other side of your office. Every time you use it, you got to stand up, go get the stapler, come back, sit down, but you're standing, right? You're taking a break. Try a different commute if you can. For a lot of us, that maybe isn't the easiest way. Ask about sit-stand workstations. The more we ask about it, hopefully something will change there. But if you can't, again, you can stand. So here are just a couple of examples of some sort of put together workstations and some really nice ones. This is the one that I have in my office. This is an Ergotron sit-to-stand workstation. It has a little lever on it. It's great. It moves up and down. So when I sit, I actually feel pretty embarrassed about that, so I can lift it. But mostly I stand. The one that we have in our lab, this is one of my students. Again, this is an Ergotron product. It just clips onto the table. Again, it can kind of go up and down. These are the ones that they also have in the library. These two are homemade ones. Again, whatever it takes. I was talking to Jana earlier today. She said she turns over her big mixing bowl and puts her computer on top of it. Whatever. If it works, do it. This is the one she has in her office. So again, this is a wall-mounted one. This was from IKEA. I'm not sure that they have it anymore, but you're right. If you go online to IKEA Hack Standing Desk, you can make one for like $20. I know. It's all about the Google though. So that's another one. This one is another Ergotron product, a fuller desk that doesn't have the screens. And those are great too. They're adjustable and nice and easy to use, and more of a workspace if you need a workspace. All right, here's my favorite part. So what can you do at home when you're really sedentary? Take as many breaks as you can. If you are watching TV, my favorite thing to do is either to stretch and roll, because I don't ever do that, and so that's kind of my incentive to watch TV is that I have to stretch and roll. Or I fold the laundry, because at least I'm up and moving. I'm not sitting while I'm folding. Move at every commercial. Go up and get something to eat. Or again, if you're on your computer, go get some water. Veggies, right. If you're going to eat veggies, that's fine. Don't go get, a handful of chocolate chips. Do your cleaning in small bouts, so you're moving around more. Do a little dance while you're cooking. That's my favorite thing. Hand wash the dishes. Takes longer. You're standing. Having a get together. Get rid of the chairs. Nobody uses them anyway. They all stand around your kitchen counter, so why even have them? Get out of the car when you pick your kids up from school, that sort of thing, unless it's -30, in which case you won't. But if you are going to start standing, just a few kind of tips for you. Make sure that you're standing with correct posture, so that your screen, your computer, is eye level, or the top of your screen is right at eye level, so that you're not having to do this while you're standing. So nice and straight. Your elbows should be at about 90 degrees when you're typing, but you should just have a straight, neutral posture. A lot of people have a hard time for the first 2 weeks. It is not easy, and I will not tell you that it's easy. When I come back in August, from being at home during the summer. I'm like so exhausted for 2 weeks. It's awful. I'm so tired because I'm going back to my standing desk. Yeah.
There's also those mats for standing on, because sometimes my heels bother them. They're reasonable, so you can get a little mat
the little
stand on.
kind of squishy mats to stand on. Those are great. If you generally wear a heel on your shoe, take them off. Do not have the heels at all. Kick them because that changes your posture a little bit. So that induces a lot of that low back pain. In one of the studies I read, the major complaint with standing in a workplace was that the subjects were complaining about having to change their footwear. I roll my eyes at you. You have to change your footwear. I take my shoes off in my office, but I suppose, just wear flatter shoes. It doesn't really, I don't know, this is your health we're talking about here, So, I don't know. So kick the heels. Careful about locking your knees, so make sure you're moving while you're standing. We don't want anybody to pass out. That actually, believe it or not, that did happen to a student in one of my classes. She was at the standing desk, and she kind of, fell into another student, and I was so mortified. I thought, oh my gosh, are you going to be okay? A little scary, but feel free to move around. That helps, right? That's a lot better for you. So don't feel discouraged if you want to start standing more and you find that it's really hard. It's not easy. Give it 2 weeks; it'll get a lot easier. So 2 weeks is kind of the time there. So how much sitting is too much? That's not the right question to ask. The question to ask is, how can I move more? What can I do to move more? So my take-home point today is, it doesn't matter how much you exercise, sitting will increase your risk for chronic diseases, even if you get your daily dose. We hope that you do get your daily dose, but think about what you're doing for that other percentage of your time. So thank you very much for listening. If you have questions or comments, I'm happy to. So the question was, does it make a difference if you're sitting on the floor versus sitting on a chair? To be totally honest, I'm not sure. I would imagine if you're sitting on the floor and you don't have a back to the chair, again, you're going to activate a lot of the muscles in your back and your core, which would be better than sort of sitting and reclining in a chair. But in terms of what happens physiologically, I'm entirely sure.
So to clarify, I thought you said that sitting on one of those balls is somewhat equivalent to standing?
Yeah, and a lot of the research where they've done multiple trials, the caloric expenditure of sitting on an exercise ball is similar to the caloric expenditure of standing. Mostly because you're activating, and there may be a little bit of a caveat there, but you're activating some of those core and hip muscles in order to keep yourself stable on the ball. One of the things I noticed in those studies was that the individuals, when they're sitting on the exercise balls, they were new to that. So I would imagine that after a period of time, they become very good at sitting on the exercise ball, and then you don't have quite the same amount of energy expenditure. So there really, in those studies, there really was no familiarization period with the exercise ball before.
So the same thing happened with standing. As you get better, do you burn less because your body's used to it?
That's a really good question. Would you burn less if you become used to standing? And I'm going to say probably not. I mean, you're still activating those muscles. They still need energy. You're still going to use the same amount of glucose and fat in order to serve them. So.
Your studies were on adults. I assume the same principles apply to kids. I think of my son who loves to spend hours lying on the floor with his Lego. So.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. The same principles do apply to kids. And actually, there's a plethora of research that's very similar to all of this with adults, with children, especially with children in video games. Mm-hmm. So yes, they do all the same things apply to kids. And actually, when I was talking about the knowledge-based workers and their increased consumption of food, the same thing happens to kids when they play video games. They don't even feel hungry, but they end up eating more afterwards without even realizing it.
I'm Carrie.
This is Carrie Schmidt. I'm sorry I hadn't met her prior to being here, but she's from Ergotron, and if you have questions about posture or the Ergotron products, I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you about them.
Yeah, in answer to the question about what happens if you're standing, does your energy consumption go down? what you need to think about is the fact that whether you're sitting or standing, after 20 minutes in any particular posture, your metabolism is going to flatten. So that's the reason you need to keep moving, because you get this wonderful burst of metabolic action happen. It spikes up every time you make a movement. So if you're sitting for 20 minutes, get up, stand, and then your body's going to take a little while to kind of reach homeostasis again. And that's when you've got that really active, energy burst. But then after you stand for 20 minutes, it's going to level off again. So postural rotation is what we're trying to get at with the sit-stand workstations. We want you to continuously work your metabolism. And we're not, I don't even look at it anymore as calorie burn. That is not really the focus as much as it is the fact that you are keeping your metabolic system going, which means your cells are detoxifying, and that's why a lot of the problems happen to be cardiometabolic, because it all has to do with metabolism.
Is the same things apply when you're sleeping, or is that completely different?
That's totally different. Yeah, sleeping's a completely different ballgame. Our bodies go through a lot of processes while we're sleeping to regenerate things that have happened throughout the day and recover, and so that's
So getting back to your
so the question was, which is worse than smoking or sitting? Yeah, that's a tough one to answer. I think, and that's why I chose it. Is sitting the new smoke? Is it the new bad thing for your health? And yeah, it absolutely is the new bad thing for your health. I don't think I really want to do a whole lot of either, or any smoking. Not obviously.
So I suppose the advice would be the same if I've been sitting for the last 20 years at my job here, or if I've been smoking for the last 20 years, your advice is to quit. It's pretty simple.
And just like quitting your job.
Finally get to stand up station.
Go back to smoking. Thanks very much.